prepare this presentation with that in mind. So my goal is actually to talk about guilt and failure. And as I was talking about failure, as I was thinking about the title and things, I wanted to tweak it just a little bit, and I want to talk about guilt and fear. Because I think that is in a really great alignment of, you know, what we are actually afraid of as homeschool moms is we're afraid that we are going to fail. So we're going to actually talk about guilt and fear today and eliminating those feelings in our homeschool. And my goal is that by the time we're done, we will have talked about, one, how do you identify what's really going on when you have guilt or fear showing up in your homeschool, you know, in you, and then also just give you a couple tools and some things, some resources and steps to consider doing as you are, you know, once you've identified it, you know, what do you actually do? So let me tell you a little bit about myself though. My name's ToriAnn Perkey, like Allison said, and I have been homeschooling for 16 years. It makes me feel like a grandma in the homeschool community. I feel like I've been doing this for a really long time. I have 4 kids. My oldest just finished up, well, at December, she finished up her first semester at BYU, Idaho, and now she is prepping to go on a mission at some point. She's been called to the Arkansas Little Rock. She was supposed to go into the MTC on the 15th next week, but we'll see what happens with her. I have 3 other kids. I have a 17-year-old, a 15-year-old, and a 13-year-old. And we've been homeschooling from the very, very beginning. And we've done all different kinds of homeschooling in that mix. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get going. As I think about my homeschool journey, it is not what I expected it was going to be. I had all of these expectations that it was going to turn out a certain way. I had all these plans and visions. I was excited about homeschooling. I was one of those moms who wasn't going to homeschool until I really started researching it. My oldest she's just really kind of different. And I just thought, oh, homeschooling's a better fit for her. We got started. And the journey from there to where we are now, it just radically changed. And along the way, there have been massive amounts of guilt and massive amounts of fear. And I've had to work through both of those feelings a lot, which is why as I sit here today in a place where I have those feelings mostly under control most of the time, I feel like I'm in a place where I can share with you kind of my journey and some of the things I've discovered over the years. Because it's interesting. So, you know, the guilt, the fear of how things are going to turn out is getting less and less and less. And the guilt for what we haven't done has the chance to grow more and more as I move farther along the homeschool journey. I'm farther towards the end of my journey than the beginning, at least with my kids. And it's kind of an interesting place to be. So that's a little bit about me. And on top of that, I run a business helping other homeschoolers. I call it's Homeschool to Homeschool. And you can find me online on Facebook and on my website. And I have I do free videos every week to help people out. So just want to give you so if you like what you see here, there's lots of places to get additional free content from me. And I talk a lot about these kinds of principles as well as do some other things. Okay, so let's talk about fear and let's talk about guilt. Let's talk about where they come from, why do they show up in our homeschool all the time? Well, if you think about it, fear is all about the future. It's all about the unknown. And with homeschooling, we have a lot of unknowns. We have, you know, we don't know how our kids are going to turn out. We don't know if that curriculum we pick is going to turn out. We just don't know. And guilt comes from the past. Guilt's all about looking backwards and looking at what has happened and possibly feeling regret. Saying, oh, I wish X had happened instead of Y. So fear is about the future. Guilt is about the past. And both of them, fear and guilt, stem from expectations. So we have expectations that we either hope things will turn out a certain way in the future, or we wanted certain things to turn out a different way in the past. And what happened, the reality, is different than the expectation. It's so tricky, you know, because there's all these shoulds, like should be, you know, my kid should be able to do this by a certain time. My kid should turn into this kind of kid. And that's the fear in the future. And then these shoulds in the past, you know, oh, I should have done this differently. Oh, I should have started this sooner. Oh, I wish we hadn't done this. You know, there's all these shoulds both directions. And should has all of this weight. Expectations have all of this weight because we as parents have so much responsibility placed on us by Heavenly Father, right? We have the responsibility we're given these children to raise them in righteousness. We are supposed to raise them up to be something. Now, over the years, when my kids were little, my goal was that they would turn into righteous Latter-day Saints. They would go on missions. And as they've gotten older and I've started to watch them develop their own choices, and my kids are all on the range, and I've watched family members make different choices, I'm realizing the line for my family and my children is that I want my children to grow up to be successful, contributing adults. That's what Heavenly Father wants for my children. And that is my responsibility. Now, I have hopefully teaching my children as part of our homeschool, as part of our family, that I believe the best way to become a successful, contributing adult is through the principles that we learn in the gospel. But if they choose something different, my goal with their education and with our family is to get them to adulthood so they can be successful in contributing and hopefully embrace those gospel principles. And that's a big responsibility. That is a huge responsibility with all kinds of expectations built in. And on top of that, there's everything, all the expectations that are built in on the church, in the church piece, and in what I believe God's told me to do. And then there's also the expectations coming from the culture that I live in. And whether that's, your community culture or your family culture, you have all of these different expectations coming at you. And so when you're trying to figure out, where does my fear and my guilt from, all these things I'm afraid of, all these things I feel bad may have happened, we have to look at them through the lens of, well, what did I expect? And what do I expect? And where is the disconnect? Or where is reality not lining up with those expectations? Because if we take a few minutes and we think about that, suddenly we can start to sort of distill down where they're coming from. And the reason that this is important, the reason that it's important to kind of figure out where guilt and fear are coming from is because once we can kind of take a look at it, and we can take a look at it as we look at the expectations, then you can decide if you're being realistic, realistic expectations. So that's why we're going to do this. So if you're taking notes, wherever you are, what I would love to have you do is just take a minute and think about what are some of the fears that you have associated with your homeschool. And what are some of the regrets? What are things you feel guilty about? I just want you to take a minute and think about that. And I just want you to write them down because sometimes getting them just out of our heads and onto paper can be really valuable. Now, let me give you examples of things that are showing up in my life currently. And you're going to hear some of my same children come up over and over again because it always seems like we have some kids that we worry about more than others or we struggle with more than others. So my 17-year-old, here's a fear that I have still, even after we've been doing this for 16 years. So he's 17 and I'm not sure he's going to go to college. Like he's just not academically showing up in a way that means that college is probably an option for him. And I don't know what that means, what his life looks like. Now he loves to dance and he has talked about maybe becoming a professional dancer, which has its own set of fears for me when it comes to that world and what that might mean for him. But I'm thinking, well, if he doesn't go to college and he doesn't have a lot of other aspirations, what does his life look like? Is he going to end up in my basement at 30, living, in my basement? There's that. So I have those fears. And I'm thinking, okay, so what are my expectations that line up with those fears? And I start to say, okay, well, my expectation is that a kid leaves at 18, that they get some kind of education. It used to be that my kids all went to college. Now it's like, well, I expect that they're going to get some kind of skill set, some kind of education so that they can then support themselves, so that they can live on their own, they can be happy, they can move on with their life. So I'm trying to figure out what's the fear versus the expectation. So what's an example of a worry or a regret? What's something that I thought would happen that just didn't play out the way I thought it was? Well, when I look back and I think about our education, I had different visions for what science would look like. When my kids were little and I would read all the books about what science could be, I had visions of us doing all kinds of experiments and having all of these fun activities and learning all of these, exploring all these concepts. And the truth is that just never played out the way I hoped. And I look at the education of some of my older children, and there's big gaps. You know, my 17-year-old and my 19-year-old who had to fill in those gaps her first year of college, I look and I think, oh my goodness, we could have done a better job. I could have done that differently. And it's easy to feel that guilt of like, I didn't do that well. I failed. And I have to look at the expectation. So my expectation was that by the time my oldest got to a certain age, she would be able to do certain basic things, and it didn't happen. And I have to look at that and think about, how do I feel about that? How do I feel about that? And right now I'm just having you sort of take some time and think about those. And then what we'll do is we'll go in a little bit about what do you do now that you've got that list of fear and that list of regret, like they're just sitting there heavy. And so we're going to take a minute and we're going to pull it apart. We're going to talk about what do you do with it once you've identified it. So as you're making out that list, I do want to clarify something. Some of both of these feelings are healthy. You do not want to completely eliminate worry and guilt, and you don't want to get a worry and fear and guilt. You don't want to completely eliminate them. You don't want so much that it's paralyzing, but you don't want to eliminate them. And this is why. Some fear keeps you motivated. It keeps you from being apathetic. A little bit of fear, righteous fear, again, and we're going to talk about that in a second, gets you thinking, okay, I got to do something. There's a problem. I have to fix it. Like there's something that's not solved. And that's important because we don't want to sit in apathy with our homeschool. We don't want to be like, well, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Uh-oh, well, we're done. Like you don't want to go there. You don't want to sit in apathy. And the other thing with guilt and regret a little bit is good because looking back allows you to analyze, well, what didn't go well and what should I change? And so fear motivates us to make change, and the looking backwards allows us to think, well, what should be changed? So both of those together, there is a mix, there's value in that. And let me give you an example. Going back to my 17-year-old son, because academically he was wrestling and he was struggling, the ACT, which is the testing that we do here in Utah, which is where I'm from, that test freaked him out. And so I was worried and continued to worry, he's not going to take this test. You know, what is actually going to happen here? And that fear, properly applied, again, we'll talk about that in a second, motivated me to continue to look for different options of how the ACT could actually work for him. And I wasn't okay just saying, well, oh, well, I guess the kid's just not going to take the ACT. Oh, well, I guess he's just not going to go to college. It's not that I was okay with him not doing those things and like, well, oh, well. It was more like, look, what happens if he doesn't? What happens if he does? What do I still need to be in charge of? And like, what do I need to be involved with? So it motivated me to be looking for new answers, not paralyzing fear, but just a little bit. And ultimately, that's the goal. The goal is to have enough fear and regret to push you to keep moving you forward without so much that it's paralyzing. And I've been there. I've been there where I'm so afraid of what I may have done to my children. Fear of failure. I'm failing my kids. I don't know how many times I've laid in my bed at night with this just sense of, I just failed. I'm failing my kids. That's it. Like it's all doomed. I don't know why I'm trying. Like I've had those feelings and that weight on my chest. And it's terrible. And then you get in this downward spiral where it's like, oh, there's all this comparison and I'm looking at what everyone else is accomplishing. And it's just, you just get in this place where two really yucky things happen. And the first one is you can't feel spirit. When you are trapped in fear and guilt, you can't feel the spirit. And when you can't feel the spirit, you can't get inspiration about what needs to change. And so Satan's plan is for us to find, to get stuck in these feelings, and instead of using them to facilitate change, just to sit stuck in these feelings. And the other reason why too much is definitely a problem is it makes it impossible. When you're stuck in guilt and fear, it makes it impossible to enjoy what's actually going well. And again, Satan wants us to be miserable. So if he can keep us from feeling inspiration, and he can keep us not feeling joy, looking around and only seeing the bad, and only getting stuck, then we are both paralyzed and miserable. And that's his goal. And then we aren't able to homeschool successfully. So the way we homeschool successfully is we use these very human feelings that are very natural to, in a positive way, to motivate us, and we don't get stuck. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about before we shift into, what are the steps? What are the things to do once we've identified this, is just to remind you, and I don't know that any of you aren't aware of this, but just to remind you that when we have these feelings, some of them come from us, right? Well, all our feelings come from us, but some come from our own thoughts. We are observing something and we say, oh shoot, my kid's 11 and he's not reading yet. And what does that mean? And you're playing out all those scenarios. But it is exacerbated when we have experiences with family members or friends, or either other homeschool people online or at the park, when we can go to the park and interact with other people, and they start talking and asking questions, or we start comparing, everything gets magnified. Because it can now, comments can feed your own sense of doubt in yourself, or comparing and seeing where another kid is compared to your kid can feed all of those feelings. And that is miserable. So, I'll give you an example. I had kids who weren't reading. I did actually have a kid who at 11 was still really struggling with reading. And my mom would say something like, wow, yeah, he's not reading yet. Are you worried about that? And there was a part of me that wanted to be like, yeah, I'm worried about that. He's 11. Yes, I'm really, really afraid. But, if I say that, and then it feeds that, and then she's like, oh, well, should you do this? Or, have you thought about putting him in school? Or, maybe you should be doing this. And then suddenly I'm just stuck versus just looking at her and going, yeah, that is a concern, but we're working through it, right? So anytime you have guilt and fear, you'll have other people saying and doing things that can magnify that. And it's not necessarily that the problem is any worse. It's just that it's like an echo chamber, and all of those comments are bouncing around inside your head. So it's something to be aware of that can also, so some of this that we're just about to talk about can be mitigated. It can help mitigate these comments and the comparison and all of the other things that are coming along too. Okay, so you've identified guilt. You've identified fear. You've taken the time, and I really do think it's valuable to put them down on paper. What are my fears? What are the things I regret? I want to give you 5 steps, and they're not necessarily in order, but they kind of feel that way. 5 principles maybe that I strongly recommend to help eliminate the overwhelming guilt and the overwhelming fear, and just keep it in a place where it's actually useful. And the steps are know, embrace, clarify, pray, and remember. We're going to go through each one of those individually. I just want to watch my time really quick. I want to make sure I leave time for questions at the end if there are any. Okay, so let's start with know. So one of the first principles I recommend is it's imperative that you know Heavenly Father's plan for your family and your homeschool. It is imperative that you have a vision of what He wants for you, because every homeschool is different, because every situation is different. And His plan for your family is going to be distinct and unique and perfectly sculpted to meet the needs of you and your children. But you have to know what it is. You have to figure that out. And it's a combination of a couple things. First of all, it's Heavenly Father's knowledge of the future of your children and the future of your family, and the future of the world. But it's also a mix of, your vision, this vision of what your homeschool should be is also a mix of your personal desires for your family culture, what's important to you as parents, what do you believe about education, what do you believe about children and autonomy, and all of those things come together. So it's a combination of you and your family, as well as Heavenly Father. And getting clear on that vision is super, super important. And now I actually have a free class, a little training that helps you walk through how to create a vision if you don't know how to do that. And I'm not sure the best way to share that, so I will talk to Allison afterwards. It's super easy. It's like a recording, and you just listen through, and it talks you through the steps of how to create that, how to create a vision of what you want your homeschool to be like, and include Heavenly Father in the process. And a reason, so let me give you an example of why this is really important, why knowing the vision for your family is helpful. So throughout the years, there was only one constant that Heavenly Father would give me, even as things would kind of shift and change and we'd try different things, was that my children needed to focus on creativity and problem solving. And that kind of instruction was so fascinating to me because it didn't line up with a subject. It was kind of like a way we were supposed to homeschool. And I would ask and I would say, well, what about this or what about this? And the answer I'd always get is, just you focus on these things. I was like, okay. And sometimes it felt like we would focus on those things to the exclusion of other stuff that felt more important if you were looking at like academics, because sometimes it would mean games or activities that I couldn't plug into different holes. And it meant that we had less time to do, certain kinds of straight memorizing or straight, content learning. Well, I'm looking at our current world situation and recognizing that moving forward, my children are going to move into a world that potentially is very, very different than the one I grew up in, and potentially will require higher levels of creativity and problem solving than I could have ever imagined when I was schooling my children when they were 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I had none of us had any idea, right? As all of these things are changing, our world is going to be different coming out of this COVID-19 experience than it was going in. And I had this epiphany moment the other day where I was like, I may actually have been schooling my children for this situation and trusting that the vision I had for my homeschool given to me by Heavenly Father was more important than than whether or not they knew certain science concepts. And it was actually a moment of such peace and relief that came along. Now, now my vision has, to some extent, I feel has been validated, but I went years clinging to the trust that Heavenly Father had given me a vision for my homeschooling that actually was right. And I had to trust that when there were many signs that may have indicated something else. It was such an interesting trust and faith process. And so one of the things I always recommend is that you write down your vision. You write it down and so you can look at it. What do you feel like Heavenly Father wants for your family? And then what also matters to you? Okay, so that's know what Heavenly Father wants for your family. The second thing that I recommend, the second principle or step, is to embrace the unique, changing family that you have been given. You have different children, different situation, different resources available. Everything about your homeschool is completely unique. No one else has the mix that you have. So your homeschool is not supposed to look like any other homeschool. And it will change as your family situation changes. When all my kids were younger, we had this amazing homeschool where we would gather in the morning, we would spend the day together, we would do different activities. I would do some with everybody, I'd do some independently. Like, we had this whole rhythm. And then I had teenagers. And suddenly my older kids were off doing these things. And it was so hard to figure out how to balance the older kids and the younger kids. And now all my kids are older, all my kids are teenagers. And suddenly I'm in a position where I need to work and I didn't have to before. And so our timing is different and how we gather is different. And what we do is very, very different than what we did 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Very different. And so embracing that means that I don't necessarily have to feel guilty that how we're currently doing our homeschool is different, even though that means my 13-year-old gets a very different homeschool experience than my now 19-year-old had at 13. Because I have had moments where I feel bad that her experience was so different than his. And what I have to remember is that Heavenly Father sent my children not only to me and my family, to our family, but he sent them in the order he sent them. If I can embrace that God planned my family order, that means that my 13-year-old came when he's supposed to be here, and my 19-year-old came when she was supposed to be here, which meant that she needed a different kind of homeschool than I am giving to my current 13-year-old. And that's okay. That is part of the plan, because everything is going to be different. Now, right now, everything is different for everyone. But, and that's another thing to remember, is that what your homeschool looks like in an emergency or in a crisis, whether it's a worldwide crisis or it's just a personal family crisis, is also going to be different. And we can have guilt and fear associated with, you know what, we had cancer in the family, we had to take a year off, or my husband lost his job and we spent 6 months moving across the country and didn't cover a lick of academics. Like, fear and guilt show up when we have emergencies like that. And if we can embrace that life has a rhythm and a pattern, then we can trust that God knew that was going to happen. And he's going to take care of us. He's going to fill in the gaps. He's going to take care of the pieces. And when we can trust that personal revelation will come to tell us how to handle any particular situation, then we're able to step in and fully own what's currently happening and kind of let go of the guilt and the fear that can show up because it's not what we expected. Because the expectations show up in the moment as well as in the plans. So that's embrace. Embrace the unique, changing family that you have, and it will always be changing. Okay, so the next one, the third one, is clarify. Clarify the division of responsibility, the learning responsibility. And what I mean by this is that a lot of guilt and fear can show up if we feel, as the mom, as the teacher, that we are responsible for everything that happens with our child. And there's a lot of reasons this happens, and I won't go into all of them, but I think part of it is because when our children are little, we are so in charge of them, and we're in charge of everything about them and teaching them everything. And as they get older, there is more and more and more of the responsibility that goes to the child. Now, the child is always responsible for how much they learn. Like, the division of responsibility means that you as the mom are the teacher and your child is the learner. And while you can teach, the child actually is choosing to either learn and accept that information or not. And it becomes painfully obvious as your children become teenagers how much you have no control over whether or not they choose to learn. And so being clear, clarifying what you can control and what you can't control, can help you get rid of the fear and the guilt that comes from all of the things you can't control, but you wish were different, and allows you to focus on what you can control. So let me give you some examples of what you can control. Because when we talk about this division of learning responsibility, I think this is really, really key. So as a mom, in a homeschool environment, I can control what kind of environment I create. I can control, to a great extent, how many screens we have, what does the home setup look like, the schedule that we follow. All of those things I can control. I can control what curriculum comes in, what curriculum doesn't come in. I can control a lot of that stuff. What I can't control is whether the child chooses to learn from that curriculum. I cannot force a child to follow a schedule that I create. There are a lot of things I can't control, but I can set up an environment for the greatest amount of success. And I can provide opportunities. The other thing I control is how many activities my child is engaged in, what kind of co-op we choose to be a part of. Do we do that learning group? Do we do that, mom play date? Do I sign my kid up for an online class? Do I put them in an extracurricular activity? As the parent, I have a great deal of control about what we say yes and what we say no to, and the opportunities my kid has. I cannot control how my child chooses to engage in the co-op, in the extracurricular activity, and all those things. And we could do a whole class on the learning division and what you can and can't control, and how you motivate your child to want to engage in the things you're creating. But from a guilt and fear perspective, it's all about clarifying what you can control and what you can control and can't control, and letting go of what you can't control. And this is so, so, so hard. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, yeah, but I still haven't figured this out. So let's think about this. Like, if we go back to my ACT example with my 17-year-old son, I can't force the kid to take the ACT. I can drive him to the place, I can sign him up, but in the end, he has to walk in and take it, right? So if he's telling me he refuses to take it, what are my choices? What are my options? And this is where having just enough fear of like, okay, this is an important piece, motivated me to continue to find, kind of figure out what was he really afraid of. And then also sitting in and saying, okay, so if he is afraid, how can I structure things differently? And it caused me to look for a different kind of class structure where I could do some tutoring with him and a couple other kids. And we've actually been able to really shift to the point now where he is actually willing to consider taking it. And Cassandra just made a comment in the chat that there was a really great class this morning all about learning responsibilities. That if that's something you want to spend more time on, then I would strongly recommend taking a look at that class, because this is really key to letting go of some of these feelings. Okay, so the third one is embrace the difference, the distinction and the division of responsibility in who's doing the learning and who's doing the teaching. Number four is pray, and specifically pray for peace. There's so many unknowns with homeschooling, so many unknowns. And that has a lot to do with, not only do you not know what's going to happen in the future, but you're dealing with a lot of little human people who have their own agency. And there's a lot that we don't know as homeschool moms. I mean, we aren't trained as teachers, we aren't trained in educational ways, and sometimes that can be good, and sometimes we can struggle as a result. You know, there's a lot of things you need to know to be, you know, as you're going along, and we don't know those things. So you want to pray for peace. And specifically what I mean for that is I like to do what's called the spirit check. And I believe the spirit check is a really helpful tool for all kinds of things going on in your life, but I use it all the time in my homeschool. And basically, I check in with Heavenly Father in my prayers and I say, okay, is there something I need to change? Is everything okay? Is there something I need to change? Is everything okay? When I'm feeling fear, or I'm feeling like guilty because something isn't going well, or it hasn't gone well, do I need to change something, or is it okay? And I'm looking for a clear answer, some kind of direction within that. Now, if I need to change something, then I start saying, okay, well, what do I need to change? What am I looking for? And sometimes I get an answer right away, and sometimes I get you just need to wait. Sometimes I actually believe the answer is, you need to wait for your child's brain to develop, or you need to wait for that child to get older, or you need to wait for a new class to become available that you don't even know exists yet. And that actually happened. Like, I knew that my one son needed more. My 13-year-old needed something more in the math and sciences than I could provide for him. And I didn't know what it was. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm overwhelmed. That's an area I'm not as strong in. I don't know what I'm going to do. And 3 months later, a new type of co-op environment opened up down the street with exactly the classes he needed. And this was back when he was like 10, 11. And I thought, I didn't know that was coming. But Heavenly Father knew. And so he was like, yes, you're going to need something, just wait. So sometimes change anything isn't something you can change. It's a waiting change. And sometimes you'll get a doing okay. Like, it's okay. It's okay, whatever the current situation. It's okay that your 10-year-old doesn't know how to read yet, or maybe you need to get their eyes checked. It's okay that your 15-year-old really needs to work on learning how to work, or needs to work on relationships. It's okay if you pull back on schools, because right now you're just trying to salvage that teen relationship so that you can get back into academics. You're okay right now. And having that confirmation from the Spirit of either something to change or something, it's okay, let things go, even in pieces of your homeschool, means that you can then stand on the answer. So when someone comes to you and says, hey, like when my mom would come and say, you know what, your kid can't read, I would get the answer that, you know what, just keep doing what you're doing, which was pretty, you know, I won't go into all the details of what we were doing with him, but I was able to go back to my mom and say, you know what, I feel like this is what we're supposed to be doing right now. Like I'm praying about it, and that's the answer I'm getting. There's a power that comes from an answer like that. I mean, how can you argue with, I've prayed about this and I have this answer? Oh, excuse me. So that's my fourth piece, is pray for peace. Now the last one, the fifth principle, the fifth step that I recommend is, remember that the atonement of Jesus Christ is designed not just for when we make a mistake, but it's also there to compensate for the things that happen that we can't fix. Just in this last general conference, in this last April general conference, and I apologize, I don't have the specific reference, one of our general authorities specifically talked about how the atonement of Jesus Christ is there to fix when we hurt someone else. Now, I'm not saying you are hurting your homeschool child, but when we take that and we apply it to homeschool, what it means is that if we make a mistake, if we leave a hole, if there is a gap, so specifically with regret, the atonement of Jesus Christ fills the hole. Now, I don't know how that works. I don't know how he compensates for all of the mistakes I've made, and I've made lots of mistakes, but I can remember that that I have that in my family and I can hold on to that and cling to that. That's like my last resort. I'm like, he's going to make it okay. The atonement of Jesus Christ makes it okay somehow. So if I continually remember that, I can sort of, it's like a balm that I can put over the things that I've done that I was like, wow, I really wish we'd done that differently. And I'm also in a position where I can embrace and accept the fact that I'm going to make mistakes in the future. And that fear that I might mess my kids up, I know that there is something outside of me that ultimately takes care of that. Because the Lord knows I am doing my best. I am trying, I am praying, I'm showing up every day. I'm working really hard at this. And so if I have that power behind me, I'm able to just take a deep breath and I'm going to say, okay, it's going to be okay. You know, I think that's the important thing, is remembering with all of this, when we have guilt show up, when we have fear show up, we feel paralyzed, when we feel like we're swimming in it, when we have people asking us things and we're feeling overwhelmed and we're feeling frustrated and we don't know how to answer people, is remembering that Heavenly Father has your back. Heavenly Father is waiting and can send you angels to help you. He has put in place all sorts of tools, personal revelation, the peace that comes from prayer, answers, ways to get answers, and then also the fact that he's kind of created this fallback plan when all else looks like it's not going to, when nothing else seems like it would fix the problem. All of those things are in place. He is watching, he's waiting, and he's there helping and giving answers. And so as we wrap this up, before we go into just a few minutes of questions, here's my question for you. If you take a minute and you listen to the Spirit, and I hope that you're in a position where it's not so crazy around you, that maybe you have a little bit of peace and quiet. What's one thing that the Spirit's whispering to you right now? Because I found that when we listen to these kinds of things, there's so much coming at us. So I would want you to say, what's the next step the Lord wants you to do in terms of guilt and fear? Does he want you to say a prayer? Does he want you to journal? Does he want you to write down your vision? Does he just want you to take a step back and feel the peace that comes from knowing that he's going to take care of you? What is the next thing that the Spirit is whispering? What is the one thing you need to do coming out of this? What's the one thing? And if you take a minute to find that, then as you're leaving this presentation, wherever you're engaged in, whether it's live or whether it's when it's recorded, there's one nugget that you showed up. So there's one piece that the Lord wants you to take out. And that's what I would pray you would get out of this, all of this information that I've put in front of you about how to identify guilt and fear, and then some different things that you can do when you have all of that guilt and fear, washing over you. Because sometimes all we can handle is one thing, particularly in times when everything is in upheaval. All we can handle is one thing. And if we're doing one thing, we're continuing to move forward. And the Lord rewards effort. We heard that in the last general conference too, right? The Lord loves effort and he rewards effort. And that's what I think when we're pursuing a great and noble cause, homeschooling is right there at the top of the list. So it's very, very powerful to know that the Lord wants us to succeed and wants us to be successful. And so that wraps up my presentation. That wraps up my portion of this, but I just wanted to leave it open for questions. If you have any for me that are specific to this or just to homeschooling in general, I will now take questions. And Allison's back. Hello,
Hi,
Allison.
I'm back. Well, I was here the whole time, but I didn't think you needed to see me. Okay, so does anybody have any questions? If you do, go ahead and type them in the Q&A box or the chat box. Where did my chat go? I know that somebody mentioned the class this morning, and the two classes today really did go well together, I thought.
Yay! And if there are no questions, that's okay too.
Okay. So for today, I just want to remind everyone that these things will be available for anybody who wants to view them. They will be on our Latter-day Saint Home Educators Facebook page and on the YouTube channel and website. And we will have new classes next week at 11 and 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Eastern time. So ToriAnn, thank you so much. That was so wonderful, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and I hope everyone stays healthy and well.
Thank you.